Captain Garrett Stoll had already decided the boy was going to die, and he had decided it the way men like him usually decided things, quietly, without quite saying it out loud, with the unbothered confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in a way that cost him anything personal. He stood behind the open door of the state tactical truck, with a radio in his hand and his jaw set, looking up at the water tower the way you look at a problem you've already filed under unsolvable. 640 yards out, give or take, on the catwalk that ringed the tank, a man named only on a learner's permit found in a stolen truck was holding a rifle in one hand and a road flare in the other. Below him, lashed to the base of the tower with cargo straps, sat 4 propane cylinders and a hand-built manifold that anybody who'd spent 10 minutes around a barbecue could see was meant to do exactly one thing. And zip-tied to the ladder rail beside the man, in a Little League shirt 2 sizes too big, was a 13-year-old boy named Eli Brandt, who had stopped crying about 20 minutes ago. Which was worse. The wind in Sage Bluff that afternoon came off the high desert flats from the west-southwest, 12 miles an hour and gusting 15, dry enough to crack your lips, carrying the smell of sage and hot asphalt, and, faintly, propane. It was the kind of wind a person who didn't shoot would never think about. It was the only thing Della Rourke was thinking about. She was standing at the edge of the cordon in a fleece vest and jeans, the way a substitute math teacher who volunteered weekends at the county range might stand, which was exactly what the people of Sage Bluff believed her to be, and had believed for the better part of 3 years. Sheriff Dale Hollis had called her that morning not as a marksman but as a favor, because she knew the high ground around town better than his deputies did, and he'd wanted a second set of eyes on the approach roads. That was the story. She let it stay the story while she watched a wind she could read like print push a road flare smoke sideways off the tower, and did the arithmetic without meaning to, because some kinds of arithmetic don't ask your permission. Stoll's designated marksman was a state trooper named, she'd heard somebody call him this, Grant Young. Prone behind a bolt gun on the hood of an SUV, ranging the catwalk through his scope and not liking what he found. She could tell he didn't like it from 30 feet away, from the set of his shoulders, from the way he kept lifting his head a half-inch to glance at the flag somebody had stuck in the dirt. A man only checks the when that many times when he doesn't trust his own answer. He's not going to take it, Della said. She said it quietly, mostly to Sheriff Hollis, who was standing next to her chewing the inside of his cheek. He's got to take it, Hollis said. That man drops that flare, those kids in the daycare across the street. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The daycare was 40 yards from the base of the tower. The propane rig wasn't a bomb in the technical sense. It was worse than a bomb. A bomb you could clear a radius around. This was a man who could turn a residential block into a fireball whenever his nerve broke, and his nerve was breaking. You could see it in the way he kept switching the flare from hand to hand. Stoll walked the line, pretending he wasn't sweating. He'd been unseen 90 minutes, and he had a hostage negotiator on a bullhorn who'd run out of things to say, and a marksman who couldn't solve the wind, and a county sheriff looking at him like he was the problem, which Stoll did not appreciate. When he reached Hollis, he didn't look at Della at all, which was its own kind of statement. "We're going to give the negotiator another pass," Stoll said. "He's done listening," Hollis said. "Look at him. With respect, Sheriff, this is a state operation now, and my marksman will engage when I have a solution I'm confident in." "Your marksman's been confident for 10 minutes and he hasn't pulled," Della said. That made Stoll look at her, up and down once, the way certain men inventory a woman they've decided is furniture. "And you are. She's the range officer out at the county club," Hollis said. "She's been running long-line drills off that ridge for 3 years. Garrett, I'm telling you, listen to her. The range officer." Stoll almost smiled. "Ma'am, this is 600 yards with a quartering wind onto a moving target with a child 18 inches off the line of fire. My trooper trained 11 months for exactly this. I'm not handing him notes from the bleachers. Here is the thing the narrator can tell you that Captain Stoll could not have known. The woman he had just dismissed had, in another life and under another name, solved harder problems than this, in worse light with less time, and had done it in her head, because the place she came from did not always give you a ballistic computer, and the men who survived there were the ones who could turn wind and distance and the curve of a falling round into a number fast enough to matter. Marksmanship at distance is not finally about steady hands. It is about mathematics performed under fear. Della Rourke had been, before she stopped being, one of the best in the world at the second part. She didn't argue with Stoll. Arguing with a man like Stoll only convinced him he was right. Instead, she crouched next to the trooper, Grant, close enough to speak under the noise, and she didn't reach for his rifle. "What's your dope?" she said. He glanced at her, uncertain, then back to the scope, because the boy was right there in it. 640 laser, I've got a come-up dialed. It's the wind. Flags are saying 10, 12, but it's gusting and the valley's funneling it. I put one of these inside that catwalk rail and I might walk it into the kid. You won't, because you're not going to dial the wind. You're going to hold it. She kept her voice level and certain, the way you talk to a man who's about to make the most important decision of his career and needs to believe the ground under him is solid. It's a full value left to right, but it's not steady, so a dialed correction's going to be wrong half the time you break the shot. Hold off the rail, not the man. When the flags lay down flat, that's your window. He's got a dead man in the flare hand and the rifle in the other, so you don't go for the man. You go for the rig. Manifold valve, the brass coupling on the crossfeed. You hit that, you vent it, and the wind carries it away from the daycare, and the worst he's got left is a road flare and a single shot. Grant stared at her. Hold off the rail. That's, what, 1.5 mil of wind I'm just eyeballing? 1.7, she said. At your velocity, in this density altitude, on this heading, 1.7 mils of left edge. The valve's the bright spot under the second cylinder. You got maybe a minute before he stops being scared and starts being calm, and calm is when he drops it. It was a true thing she'd just said about the man on the tower, and it was the kind of true thing she knew the way other people knew, their own phone number. A frightened man hesitates. A frightened man who has crossed over into calm has already made peace with the ending, and there's no negotiator on earth who can talk a man back from peace. The smoke off the flare had begun to climb straighter. The gusts were spacing out. Grant settled back into the rifle. He breathed. He found the valve. And then his hands betrayed him the way hands do when a young man understands that a child's life is hanging on a number he isn't sure of. And the muzzle made a small circle it shouldn't have made, and he came off the trigger. I can't, he said. I can't hold 1.75 by feel. Not with him right there. If I'm wrong. There are moments that close like doors. The narrator wants you to understand that Della Rourke had spent 4 years arranging her life specifically so that this door would never open in front of her, and that she recognized it the instant it appeared, and that she stepped through it anyway, which was the first honest thing she had done in a long time. Then let me, she said. Stoll's voice came in over them. Absolutely not. But Hollis had already put a hand flat on the captain's chest, and the trooper had already rolled off the rifle, because a 24-year-old man who has just admitted he cannot make a shot is grateful to anyone who will take it from him. And Della was behind the gun before the argument finished forming. She did not adjust the scope. She did not check the flags. She had been checking them the whole time, every second since she'd walked up, and the answer was already living in her body. She settled the buttstock into the soft pocket of her shoulder and let her pulse drop, the way she'd been taught to let it drop, which is not a trick of the hands but a trick of attention. And she put the reticle on the brass coupling under the second cylinder, and then she moved it left. 1.7 mils of empty desert air, and she waited. The valley breathed in. The little flags in the dirt sagged. She pressed the trigger straight back without thinking about pressing it, and the rifle ran its recoil out through her, and the round went 640 yards across the wind, and the flare smoke, and the long gold light. And the brass coupling under the second propane cylinder came apart in a hiss of white vapor that bent instantly to the east, away from the tower, away from the daycare, dispersing into the dry air like breath on a cold morning. Before the man on the catwalk had fully registered that his rig was bleeding out, she cycled the bolt, clean, fast, no wasted motion, and put a second round through the receiver of the rifle in his hand, knocking it sideways out of his grip, sending it spinning off the catwalk to clatter on the gravel 100 feet below. The flare was still in his other hand. The flare by itself was nothing now. A man holding a road flare over 4 empty propane cylinders is just a frightened man on a tower, and the tactical team was already moving up the ladder, and 40 seconds later, they had Eli Brandt's straps cut and a trooper's jacket around his shoulders, and the man was face down on the catwalk with 3 sets of hands on him. The whole thing, from the moment she lay down to the moment it was over, took under 15 seconds. Nobody on the cordon said anything for a beat that lasted too long. The hostage negotiator had stopped mid-sentence. A deputy near the truck had his mouth open. Grat the trooper was looking at her the way you look at a card trick. You watched closely and still can't explain. And Captain Garrett Stoll, who had trained for this and read about this and given speeches about this, stood very still with his radio forgotten in his hand and said the only thing there was to say, which was the same thing everyone in that parking lot was thinking. "How," he said, "did you do that?" Della Rourke handed the rifle back to its owner, butt first, and stood up and brushed the gravel off her knees and did not answer him. The boy was fine. That was the first thing, the only thing that mattered in the immediate, and Della made sure of it herself, crossing the cordon before anyone thought to stop her, crouching in front of Eli Brandt where the medics had him on a tailgate. He had a thin red line on his throat where the strap had ridden up, and a tremor in his hands and the 1,000-yard stare of a kid who'd spent 2 hours being used as a shield. But his color was good, and his pupils were even, and he flinched at the right things, which told her his brain was still wired the way it should be. "You're all right," she told him. "Not a question. Kids that age don't believe questions. They believe sentences. You did the hard part already. You stayed still. That's the whole job, and you did it." Eli looked at her. "You shot the gun out of his hand. I shot the propane first. The gun was the easy part." She said it lightly on purpose, because a 13-year-old who has been a hostage needs to be handed something ordinary to hold, and a small joke is ordinary. He almost smiled. "That was enough. My grandpa," Eli said. "Somebody's got to. He's going to." He stopped, and something in the way he stopped caught at the back of Della's attention like a thread snagging on a nail. Careful. The boy was being careful about his grandfather in a way most boys are not careful about anything. "He travels," Eli finished, "for work. He's hard to reach." "We'll reach him," Della said. "What's his name?" The boy looked at her for a long moment, weighing it, the way she'd seen grown men weigh whether to give up a name. And that, more than anything that had happened on the tower, made the hair stand up on her arms. "Owen Maddox," Eli said finally. "General Maddox," Eli said finally. "Retired." Della Rourke's hands went still on the tailgate. She had heard that name before. Not in Sage Bluff, not at the county range, not in any part of the small invisible life she built in this dry little town. She'd heard it in a different country and a different decade, spoken with the particular flat respect that men reserve for the officer who taught them the thing that kept them alive. She had heard Owen Maddox's name in the room where they had built the firing solution she had just used to make 2 shots. No range officer in the world should have been able to make. The solution that existed by design in no published manual, because the program that fathered it had wanted a method its shooters could carry out of any wreckage in their heads and nothing on paper anyone could steal. She kept her face exactly the way it had been. She had a great deal of practice keeping her face exactly the way it had been. "Okay," she said. "Owen Maddox. We'll find him." She stood and she became aware, the way you become aware of weather changing, of a man standing at the edge of the medical area who had not been there 10 minutes ago. Dark windbreaker. No agency markings, the still posture of someone who had learned that holding still made other people show their hands. He wasn't watching the prisoner. He wasn't watching the boy. He was watching her, and he had been for at least a minute, and when she met his eyes, he didn't look away, which is what innocent people do. His name was Marsh, Special Agent Theo Marsh, and he gave the first name only because Hollis asked twice, and he ran his questions out of a manila folder he held at an angle so she could see there was a folder without seeing what was in it, which was a posture she recognized from rooms a great deal less comfortable than the back office of the Sage Bluff Sheriff's Station. "You're listed as Della Rourke," Marsh said. "Substitute teacher, part-time range safety officer. Moved here a little over 3 years ago from a town outside Boise, where you taught for about a year before that. And before Boise." He let it hang, the way they always let it hang, because the silence is the question. "There's not much." "I took some time," Della said. "Family things." "How much time?" 4 years. That's a long time to be off the grid for a woman with your skill set." He closed the folder, not all the way, leaving it cracked on the desk between them so she'd know he could open it again whenever he wanted. It was the oldest move in the room, and she let him think it worked. "Because here's my problem, Ms. Rourke. I came to Sage Bluff today on something that's got nothing to do with a barricaded subject on a water tower. I came because that boy's grandfather is a man who's made some specific enemies in the last few months, and because the people I answer to had reason to think somebody might make a run at his family. And then I get here, and the threat's already been handled. And it's been handled by a substitute math teacher who put a cold bore round through a propane fitting at 600 yards in a gusting crosswind, off another man's rifle with no spotter and no ranging shot. He spread his hands. You understand why I'm sitting here. I understand you've had a long day. I've had a long 4 years, Marsh said, some of them looking for people who are very good at not being found. He leaned forward. That boy didn't end up on that tower by accident. The man who put him there had a prepaid phone with exactly one number in it, and that number is going to lead somewhere that makes my supervisor very nervous. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like the real answer. What's your name? In the next room, through the cheap interior wall, Della could hear Eli Brandt's voice, steady, answering a deputy's questions, and Hollis's low rumble, and somewhere outside the dry wind, moving against the building. She thought about a relief convoy on a road 4 years and 7,000 miles away. She thought about the number 19. She thought about a report she'd filed through a channel she'd trusted, and the way it had vanished, as if it had never been written, and the way she had vanished a few months after it, because the men who could make a report disappear could make a person disappear too, and she had decided not to wait around to find out which they'd choose. You don't need my name, she said. You need to find out who paid that man on the tower. You need to keep that boy safe until his grandfather gets here. And you need to figure out why somebody with the resources to stage a propane standoff in a county of 4,000 people thought it was worth the trouble. She held his eyes. My name doesn't get you any of that. Marsh studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up the folder and didn't open it and said, Don't leave town. General Maddox is going to want to talk to you when he lands. How long? He's already in the air. 3 hours. Owen Maddox came through the door of the sheriff's station 2 hours and 50 minutes later, in a flannel shirt and a canvas jacket that did nothing to disguise the way he carried himself. And he crossed the room to his grandson and put both hands on the boy's face and looked at him the way men in his line of work permit themselves to look at the people they love. Exactly once, in private, before they fold it back up and put it away. He didn't say anything. He just breathed. The long breath of a man who has spent 6 hours believing he might be too late and is only now allowing himself to believe he isn't. Then he straightened and his eyes moved across the room and found Della Rourke standing by the window, and everything in his face that had been a grandfather's became something older and more careful. You're the one who made the shot, he said. Della Rourke, she said. He didn't answer that. He walked toward her, slowly, the way you approach something you're trying to place, reaching back through years and faces and the geometry of 100 briefings. And then she watched him arrive somewhere, watched the recognition land, except it wasn't surprise. It was the quieter thing that comes after surprise, the expression of a man who set a line in the water a long time ago without ever really believing anything would take it. You held off the rail, Maddox said. 1.7, no dial, full value gusting, and you broke between the gusts. He said the numbers like a man reciting scripture. There are exactly 9 people who were ever certified on the lattice solution. I taught it to 6 of them myself. 2 of those are dead. He paused, and the room was very quiet, and one of them walked off a range in another country 4 years ago and never came back. Eli was watching them both with wide, careful eyes. Marsh had gone still by the door. Della said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wasn't either a lie or the truth, and she had not yet decided which one this room could survive. You want to give me your real name, Maddox said. It wasn't a threat. It was almost gentle. It was the voice of a man who had learned that raising it was a thing you only did once. No, Della said. Maddox looked at her for another second, then he turned to Marsh. Give us the room. Marsh hesitated, then stepped out and pulled the door to within an inch of the frame, which was a federal agent's idea of compromise. Maddox waited until the latch was almost closed, and then he told her what he knew, in a low, even voice, the way you read a man his own history, to find out which parts make him flinch. 4 years ago, he said, a precision fires team attached to a joint task force had been handed a target package for an engagement along a supply route, and the analyst shooter on that team had flagged the package as falsified, the heat signatures wrong, the pattern of life wrong. The whole thing built to read as a weapons convoy when it was something else. She'd refused the shot. She'd put her refusal in writing, and her commanding officer, a colonel with friends in the contracting world, had retasked the engagement to a less careful team, and the convoy had turned out to be exactly what she'd said it was, a line of trucks carrying relief workers and the families they were evacuating. And 19 people had died, and the report documenting all of it had been buried so thoroughly that for 4 years it might as well not have existed. Her name, Maddox said, was Captain Marin Vesper. 2 combat rotations. A marksmanship record that program lead had to classify because the numbers read like a typo. And she knew the lattice solution because she's the one who helped me refine it. He looked at her steadily. After the convoy, she filed her report, and then she was gone. Most people who looked at that file decided she ran. I never believed that. I think she filed it knowing what it would cost her, and then she did the only thing left to do, which was become someone nobody could find before they could finish what they'd started. The silence had a weight to it. Illy's hand had crept into his grandfather's. Della Rourke stood in the middle of it and felt 4 years of a carefully built quiet begin, very gently, to come apart. "What do you want, General?" she said. 2 months ago, I filed a complaint with the Inspector General, Maddox said. Documentary evidence that the man who falsified that target package, Colonel Reese Calder, has been running a private arrangement out of his command ever since, selling access, building leverage on people who matter. 3 of the names in my complaint are sitting in positions that make them almost impossible to touch. Calder's the load-bearing one. He's the one who buried the convoy. And he's the one who knows I filed. And 3 days ago, he moved to have the whole thing sealed on national security grounds. He held her eyes. The only thing that keeps it from being sealed is a second source. Somebody who was there. Somebody who saw the original target package and can say, on the record, under their real name, what it actually showed. And the tower, Della said. The boy. He needed me distracted, and he needed me afraid, Maddox said. Ely was both. Something moved across his face, banked and dangerous. But it was also a flag. Calder has known for 4 years that there were only a handful of people alive who could make a certain kind of shot using a method that isn't in any manual. He's had people watching for it. A range officer in a county nobody's heard of, putting a lattice solution onto a target at 600 yards in front of a state tactical team and 20 witnesses. He spread his hands. You lit a beacon, Captain. He already knows. The man on the tower had a phone reporting out, not in. The second it stopped moving, somebody somewhere knew the bait had been taken and the shooter wasn't who they expected. The door opened. Marsh came back in without being asked, which told her he'd been listening, which she'd assumed. We have a problem, Marsh said, and the controlled federal cadence had a hairline crack in it now. Somebody pinged the prisoner's transport route from outside our system 8 minutes ago. They know he's being held here. And I just had a check-in I was supposed to get from my own field office fail to come through. He looked, for the first time, genuinely unsettled. I think the reason it failed is sitting 1 level above my supervisor. Maddox was already on his feet. What happened over the next 40 minutes, the narrator will give you plainly, because the people in that station did not have time to make it dramatic, and so neither will the telling. Della Rourke took the room the way she had once taken rooms for a living. And the strange thing, the thing Marsh would think about for a long time afterward, was that nobody argued. Not Stoll, who'd come back to coordinate the prisoner handoff and ended up taking direction from a woman he'd called furniture 6 hours earlier. Not Hollis, who knew enough to know he didn't know everything and trusted her anyway, the way he'd trusted her every weekend for 3 years. She moved Eli first, off the cot in the back office where his location was now a known thing, into the building's old records room. A windowless interior space that did not appear on any floor plan a person could pull from outside, while Marsh worked the phones, burning every channel he no longer trusted and rebuilding contact with the 2 people in his chain he still did. She put the prisoner transport on a false timeline and a real one, the false one going out over the air she assumed was compromise, the real one whispered to a single deputy. And when the building went quiet at the wrong time, when the parking lot's ordinary evening noise dropped out, the way a field of insects goes silent when a predator walks through. She was the first to hear it, because she had spent years learning to listen for the absence of the right sounds. There was a man in the dark at the side of the station, by the propane tank that fed the building's heat, with a maintenance company's logo on a jacket that was too clean and credentials that Hollis would later say were the best fakes he'd seen in 30 years. He had come for the boy. He had not come expecting Marin Vesper. She did not have a rifle, and she did not need one. She came around the corner of the building the way staff walk through doors they've walked through 1,000 times without hesitation, because hesitation is what gives you away. And by the time the man understood that the person stepping into his space was not a routine, he had already lost the half-second that decides these things. She closed the distance instead of opening it, put an elbow into the soft place under his sternum with the kind of precise mechanical economy that doesn't require size, controlled him to the ground, and had his wrist bound with a length of nylon strap off the propane tank's own rigging before he'd finished deciding whether to fight. His phone was in his jacket, locked, transmitting location, which meant a dot on somebody's map had just stopped moving, which meant the next team already knew. She came back inside with the phone in her hand and laid it on the desk in front of Maddox and Marsh. "One down," she said. "He's not the last." And his phone was reporting out, which means whoever sent him already knows this place is burned. She looked at the two men. "We stopped defending a building they can find. We changed the board." She borrowed Maddox's secondary phone, the clean one, and she dialed a number she had not dialed in 4 years, a number she had carried in the back of her mind the way you carry a key to a door you never plan to open again. It rang twice. The voice that answered said nothing. It simply waited, which is how she knew she had the right number. "Saunders," Della said. "It's Vesper. I'm calling in." A pause. Then, "We figured this day was coming. We just figured we'd hear from you first. I need to secure transport at the rail siding north of Sage Bluff in 40 minutes. I've got a post-incident miner, a retired flag officer, and a federal agent, all of them active targets, plus a compromised protective chain and one secured hostile on the ground." She breathed once, slow. "I have operational control." "You always did," the voice said. 40 minutes. They made the siding with 6 minutes to spare in the back of a county utility truck Hollis drove himself, lights off, down a gravel access road that didn't appear on the maps the people hunting them would have pulled. Illy sat between his grandfather and Della with his jaw set against the rough ride and his eyes too clear, and once, when the truck jolted hard over a cattle guard, he reached over without a word and took Della's hand, and she let him, and neither of them said anything about it. The vehicle that met them at the siding moved with the particular quiet of a machine engineered not to be heard, and the woman who climbed out of it walked straight to Della without looking at anyone else, which told Della she'd been briefed and the briefing had been thorough. "Vesper," the woman said. "It's work for a little while longer," Della said. The woman looked at her with years inside the look, relief in old history, and the wary not quite belief of someone seeing a person they'd long since filed under lost. "There are people who've been carrying your name around for 4 years, she said, hoping they'd get to put it down. Marsh came down the embankment fast. "We need to move now." Third team, different approach road, 11 minutes out. Maddox looked at his grandson. Illy looked back at him with the steady directness that had not left him since the tower, and said, "I'm okay. Do what you have to do." And the general, who had crossed 3 states believing he might bury the boy, put his hand on the back of Eli's neck for 1 second, and then he turned to Della Rourke and said the only thing there was to say. "Whatever your name turns out to be," he said. "I'm glad you were standing at that cordon today." She looked at the dark line of road where 11 minutes was already becoming 10, and she reached into the pocket of her vest and closed her fingers around the small, worn weight she had carried there every day for 4 years, a challenge coin gone smooth at the edges with an insignia on one face she had not let herself look at directly in all that time. She took it out, and she looked at it in the wash of the vehicle's running lights, and she closed her hand around it again. "Let's go," she said. The testimony took the better part of a day in a protected session in front of a deputy inspector general who had been quietly building her own thread on Colonel Reese Calder for the better part of a year and had been waiting the whole time for a second source who could put her hand on the original target package and say what it had actually shown. Marin Vesper put her hand on it. She did not soften it, and she did not dress it up. She described the heat signatures and the pattern of life and the falsification, the refusal she'd put in writing, the retasking, the 19 dead, the report that had been buried. And the 4 years she'd spent living under a borrowed name in a county where the hardest decision most days was which kids needed help with which proofs. Calder's motion to seal was denied within the week on the recommendation of a reviewing officer who had been briefed on Marsh's formal complaint of operational compromise and had flagged the colonel's legal team's access to the case file as a conflict of interest. The story he tried to place with a friendly defense reporter, the one meant to paint a whistleblower as a fugitive of questionable loyalty, never ran. The reporter received a courtesy call from the deputy IG's office that used the words pending and active investigation, close enough together to make a careful man decide to wait. Calder was placed on administrative leave, and then it became something more than leave, and it happened the way these things happen to men who built everything on the belief that power protects itself, quietly, without a public fall. Just the specific silence of a door closing on a career that had assumed it was immune. Marin Vesper was offered reinstatement, full rank, back pay, the AWOL designation expunged and replaced with a notation that meant nothing to anyone without the clearance to read it. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about the cockpit of arithmetic she'd lived inside for years, the particular pleasure of a hard problem solved under pressure, and she found that she still wanted that, the way you want a language you used to dream in. Then she declined. Not because she didn't want to shoot again, she did, but because the life she had started, almost by accident, on the surface of someone else's name, had turned out to be the truer one. She had spent 4 years teaching frightened kids that there was always a way to find the answer if you stayed calm and broke the problem into pieces small enough to hold, and somewhere in there, she had stopped pretending it was a disguise. She kept the range. She turned it into something, a place outside Sage Bluff where veterans came, and first responders and people who had been in the worst minute of their lives and were trying to learn how to live in the minutes after, and she taught them what she knew, which was not really about wind and distance at all, but about the thing underneath it, the discipline of slowing your own pulse when everything in you wants to come off the trigger. She put her real name on the door for the first time in 4 years. Marin Vesper, it said. No rank. She'd refused the rank. She had not, in the end, been allowed to refuse the rest. Eli Brandt called her the day the range reopened under the new sign. He had a phone of his own now, a real one, not the careful borrowed silences of the weeks after the tower, and he said 3 things. He said his grandfather wanted her to know the commendation was going into the record whether she wanted it or not, because Maddox said you don't get to turn down the acknowledgement, only the assignment. He said the man on the tower had finally given up the number that led to Calder, so she could stop checking over her shoulder mostly. And then he said, in the plain, unguarded way of a kid who had been zip-tied to a ladder rail and decided, somewhere up there, to trust the woman at the cordon, that he'd figured out she hadn't shot the propane first because it was easy. You did it first because if you'd gone for the gun and missed, he'd have dropped the flare, Eli said. You did it in the right order, on purpose. I've been thinking about it for a month. Marin Vesper sat for a moment after the call ended, and the long gold light coming through the range office window, with her real name on the door and her real history in a record that could not be sealed or buried or filed away under classified and forgotten. She had not been the woman who climbed out of a cockpit 4 years ago and written a report that someone made disappear. She was not anymore the woman who had made herself into no one in a quiet town to survive it. She was the person who had done all of those things and carried them, and then, on an ordinary afternoon, walked up to a police cordon and let herself be exactly who she was, which had cost her a name and a quiet and 3 years of careful invisibility and had given her back, as far as she could tell, everything else. When the first man came through the door of the range that morning, young, careful eyes, hands that wouldn't quite settle, the particular stillness of someone who'd come back from a place that doesn't show up on standard maps. He stood there a second too long, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. I don't really know where to start, he said. Then start anywhere, she told him. We'll find the right place. I've got all day. She meant it. It turned out she always had.